Hi, I'm Ned Johnson. I'm a parent, educator, and author, and I want to talk with you about the importance of developing in young people a healthy sense of control. Now, like me, you may have noticed some worrying trends in young people today. One, the runaway rates of mental health disorders, of anxiety, depression, substance use disorders, all things we don't want kids to experience when they're really developing the brains that they're going to carry into adulthood. And two, what looks like disordered motivation, either kids who are obsessively driven to work at the highest possible level in ways that simply aren't sustainable, or kids who kind of don't try at all, who figure if I can't be top 10% of my high school class, why even bother? When, of course, whether they're top 10% or not, we want them to engage in building themselves and getting educated so they're prepared to have the lives they want and contribute to our world. There's a wonderful researcher named Sonia Lupin who summarizes what stresses people out, what makes people nuts with the acronym of NUTS. So N is novelty. New situations can be exciting, but also kind of stressful, right? U is unpredictability. That's what makes traffic so doggone fun. And T is perceived threat. Now, before COVID, what I can be a vector of mayhem to anyone I meet, mostly threat for children is threat to ego. Am I cool enough? Am I pretty enough? Am I smart enough? Am I athletic enough? Blah, 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 blah. And then S is a low sense of control. And it turns out that a low sense of control is the most stressful thing that people can experience. We can handle novelty, unpredictability, even threatening situations, so long as we feel that we have a sense of control and there's something that we can do there. Now, when we think about a sense of control, we think about this in two domains. One is the subjective sense of autonomy, that this is my life, that I have a say over, and I'm not just a pawn in other people's plans, right? I have autonomy, I have agency. And the brain state that supports it, meaning that the prefrontal cortex, the most recently evolved part of the brain in which reside all those executive functions of organization, planning, problem solving, decision making, but also cognitive flexibility and emotional flexibility, pretty important for mental health, that the prefrontal cortex runs the rest of the brain, including regulating the amygdala, which is this very primitive threat detecting part of our brain. Good mental health looks like this. Something threatening comes to mind or comes into view. Your amygdala warns you about it. And then your prefrontal cortex goes, we have a plan for this. Either we can solve this thing, or if it's something hard, we can simply cope with it. So what we really want to do is treat childhood and adolescence as wiring kids' brains to have that healthy sense of control and that perceived sense of autonomy. So again, that they are both able to tolerate stress and have motivation to move forward. Arguably, the most interesting research on this is by a guy named Steve Mayer, who's most well known for his work on what's called learned helplessness. You might have heard about this, where they mistreated these animals and then they learned to just sit there and endure, in this case, a mild electric shock, and never made an effort to leave the cage even when they could. Here's the study that's really interesting. It's a paper called Learned Helplessness at 50, kind of what we got right, what we got wrong. What we got wrong, said Dr. Mayer, is that these animals didn't learn to be helpless, but rather that they failed to learn a sense of control. A really significant difference, meaning that the default setting, an infant is born helpless, but it has a natural drive to want to, even 2-year-olds want autonomy. I do it, not the boss of me, right? All that stuff that we remember so fondly. So here's the paradigm study that they did. They have these two rats in a cage, rat A, rat B. Their tails are out the back. They're going to get a mild electric shock. It's pretty unhappy. It's not life-threatening, but it's stressful. Light goes off. Here comes the shock. Rat A has a wheel that he spins, and when he spins the wheel, it stops the shock. This is a good thing. Rat B has a wheel that he spins. Nothing happens. Rat A, when he spins the wheel, there's this massive activation in the prefrontal cortex, and it dampens down his stress response. This is what coping looks like. Something bad, I can handle it. Spin the wheel. The experience of having what's called an adverse experience, where there's a sense of control, is profound. They can have the rat A have this experience for a few days, a few weeks, and then disconnect the wheel. The wheel no longer works, but nobody sends the memo to the rat, and he doesn't have a stopwatch. But he believes that the wheel makes a difference because he's had that experience. And so even now he's spinning the wheel and the shock is as bad as it ever was. He's not freaking out because he's wired a brain that a neurological level knows how to cope. This is important. Mayer makes the point that it isn't actually being in control, but it's a sense of control. So we're back to the brain state. In some ways, you can think about a healthy sense of control as what it's not. You don't feel helpless, hopeless, powerless, overwhelmed, resigned to a life that you don't like. The experience of Rat A is also transsituational. This adverse experience, when they put him in another intimidating, threatening, big scary rat, loud music, bright lights, he doesn't freak out and hide in the corner as rats are naturally inclined to do. He's learned a sense of control that I can cope with this thing that's a little intense. And he goes out and explores, and he goes to the food and the wheel and all the stuff that's in the middle of the cage. It's really a big deal. Back to Rat B for just a moment. Rat B never learns a sense of control. And in a really nifty experiment that shows just how important this is, they yoke the two rats. So Rat A, when he spins the wheel, he stops the shock for himself and for brother Rat B. They have the exact same experience of how long the shock is, how soon it stops, the same amount of difficulty. But Rat B is forever a basket case because he never had the experience of feeling a sense of control and wiring his brain to be able to cope. He's forever looking to the sky for like a damsel in distress from the old time movies for someone else to save him. This is a really profound difference. Importantly, those connections that Rat A created between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the strength of those connections is the single most powerful neurological marker for mental health. So it's helpful for us as educators and as parents, as caregivers, to remind ourselves that you can treat all kids like they have a little sign on their forehead that says brains are under construction. And from both a stress perspective and a motivational perspective, a healthy sense of control is a pretty big deal. Let me pivot to talking about motivation for just a moment. When we think about motivation, there are kind of two big flavors. Extrinsic, carrots and sticks. Intrinsic, naturally want to do things. You want your kids to work hard at school and all kinds of other things. However, if we're honest, we would really not just like them to work hard. We would like them to want to work hard, meaning they're putting their nose to the grindstone. They're paying attention to their work. They're doing their best because it matters to them, not because they're being bribed to get an A or worried that they'll get their cell phone taken away from them, because there's profound differences in how brains work when they're intrinsically motivated versus extrinsically motivated. I'll come back to the moment when we talk about passionate pursuits of pastimes. So if we want kids to not just work hard, but to want to work hard, how does that even work? Okay. Something called self-determination theory, which is a model of intrinsic motivation. And this has been supported by hundreds and hundreds of studies, one of the most supported bodies of research in all of psychology. It holds that to be intrinsically motivated, there are three psychological needs that need to be met. One, a sense of competency. I don't have to be the best, but if I feel incompetent, I'm not motivated, I just want to run away because, again, so threatening, threat to my ego, right? A sense of relatedness to the person, to the teammates, to the teacher, to the coach. When I ask kids with whom I work, what's your favorite class? They'll say math. I say, fantastic, I love that. Math is great for me too. By the way, is that the class or is that the teacher? And as you can imagine, more than half the time, it's the teacher. I mean, boy, math was always okay, but this year, Miss Smith, she's so great. She makes it so much fun. Strong connections make a huge difference. Not great teachers don't get kids to work hard. They help them want to work hard. We work harder for a coach who we think likes us, and we work harder for a coach that we like, right? That's kind of how it works. And then autonomy. Autonomy is simply the sense of, I have a say, I have control. I'm not, again, a pawn in other people's plans. And of the three of these, it's autonomy that becomes increasingly important because children have more autonomy when they're in kindergarten than they do into middle school and high school, at the same time that they actually need and can handle more of it because they're becoming more competent. Everywhere that we lecture in 27 states now in 14 countries, there's a tendency by parents and educators to lean in too much, in our view, on the competency piece in ways that undermine our relatedness to our children and their sense of autonomy. And this is a three-legged stool. One leg really big and the other leg small is not a stable platform for the intrinsic motivation that we want people to have. Two other quick notes on motivation. You may know the research of Carol Dweck, who wrote a wonderful book called Mindsets. And it's simply the idea, do people think about their abilities as genetic, as naturally given, or as things that they develop by their hard work? The fixed mindset means I'm just born that way. The growth mindset says I get better with my own effort. It's very easy for kids who are talented, who are very naturally talented, naturally good at music, arts, music, just great head for math, whatever, to get stuck in a fixed mindset, because it's really easy for any adult to say, oh my gosh, you're just a natural athlete. You're so good at this. How do you just, and not tying it to the kid's effort. It rolls off the tongue to throw praise at kids, and kids lap it up like, oh my gosh, I'm just born this way. Thanks, mom and dad, for the genes, right? But the challenge is then when things get harder, they may think, I've reached the end of my natural specialness and natural brilliance, and they don't want to work hard because that's never been part of their model. Or they may think that working hard is for people who aren't naturally good, and I was one of those natural good people, right? A growth mindset in a perfect world, kids and families identify where kids do have a natural inclination, natural ability, but they get the consistent message that we build on those skills. We build on those gifts because people develop themselves by working harder. And this is an incredibly powerful message. I use this when I work with kids who are not good at or feel that they're not good at math. Well, I'm terrible at math. I'm never going to be good at math. Okay, I'm not going to try to talk you out of that. But would you be open to the idea that if you wanted to, and you may not want to, but if you wanted to, that if you worked harder at math, and I'm happy to help, that it's something you can get better at, even if you're not like the biggest math nerd ever? Simply that idea that if they wish to, that they can get better by their own effort, increases their sense of control, increases their autonomy, and increases the likelihood that they're able to work harder at something, even if it's not easy for them. Last word on motivation is this. There's something called flow experience. People may know this of being in the zone. And a flow experience is typically when people are, well, there's a wonderful researcher named Reed Larson who studied in the 90s. How is it that adolescents become intrinsically motivated? And he noted that it was not by dutifully doing their homework. Rather, it was by what he described as the passionate pursuit of pastimes. Oftentimes, homework is an extrinsic motivator because they're extrinsic rewards. I get the A, I do this, I do that. Passionate pursuit of pastimes, when kids are working hard at music or sports or artwork or coding or rock climbing or whatever, it's high effort, it's high focus, it's high determination, it's low threat. And this is a brain state. The ideal learning state is high challenge but low threat. And so in these passionate pursuits of pastimes, kids can push themselves as much as they want to do and really go at it, but it's low threat. And if we go back to the brain state I was talking about a moment, about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators, when people are intrinsically motivated, these pastimes, they pay attention to the mistakes they make because they matter to them. It's how they get better. If your kid is going to perform a song for a school assembly, your kid really wants to do well. And so if they're making a mistake, they play it over and over and over and over and over until they get it as just right so they can perform as well as they can because they care about how they do. If your kid has to do 30 minutes of piano, they're not looking at their hands or looking at the music. They're looking at the clock saying, when is this done? Kind of important stuff. We include this idea of the passionate pursuit of pastimes for this reason. As I mentioned a moment ago, we think about childhood and adolescence as developing or wiring the brain that kids carry into adulthood. One of the challenges that we can often have is kids aren't motivated yet for school. And that's crazy making oftentimes to their parents and maybe to their teachers too. And then we lean on trying to get them to work hard. And because we're blowing up their autonomy and on the relatedness, it doesn't tend to work the way that we would want. Notably, there's no place in which extrinsic motivators transmogrify into intrinsic motivators. And motivation is actually not the sum total of intrinsic and extrinsic. Rather, extrinsic motivators undermine undermine intrinsic motivation. So we want to tread lightly. If we think about developing intrinsic motivation in kids, and you have kids who are not academic, well, what do? From our perspective, you don't panic. And here's why. If a kid is working hard at anything to get better and better at something that matters to them, whether it's drawing or music, and on we go, it doesn't really matter what it is. Because if they're working harder and harder to get better in something, they're developing or wiring brains that are motivated. And when they find an academic interest, they've got the brain state that allows them to go in that direction. I will pick on my friend Bill, writing partner Bill Sticksherd, who grew up outside of Seattle, Washington. He said, I never had any academic interest, didn't read a book past page 50, didn't hit anything in on time. To go to University of Washington, I had to have a 2.5 GPA, I had a 2.8. I kind of kicked myself for that extra energy. Really was not engaged. Bill is a bright human being, but he just didn't care. What he did care about was his music. He was in a rock and roll band in high school when the Beatles came to town, and this was a big deal to him. So he'd tell himself, I'll go work on this guitar solo for 20 minutes, and then I'll do my homework. He said, I'll come down 2.5 later, completely lost track of time. And he said, I'm convinced that I wired my brain to be able to go pedal to the metal on something when it mattered to me. And so I offer this because if you have a kid who is not currently academically engaged, there can sometimes be a temptation to want to hold back from them their soccer, their theater, their whatever, to get them to work hard. But then what we're doing is trading away the thing for which they're intrinsically motivated by trying to extrinsically motivate them for something they don't currently care about. And the real loss here is to developing brains to be intrinsically motivated. Okay. So let me transition then, now that I kind of freaked you out about, you got to have your kids, offer your kids a greater sense of control, knowing that it's kind of hard, right? It's kind of hard to do that. Here's what we suggest. The first thing is that you move in the direction of thinking about yourself as a parent consultant, not you're responsible for getting your kid to do his homework. You're not the homework police. You're not the boss. One thing that kind of makes me a little frustrated is that schools tell loving parents that it's your obligation to get your kid to do his homework. And I don't like that because I don't think it's fair to task another human being with something that's impossible. Meaning, if your kid didn't want to do his homework and he just lay flat on the ground and went, la, 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 what are you going to do? You're going to duct tape him to a chair? You're going to, you tie the pencil to his hand? You couldn't make it. And so what we can do is make it so unpleasant that they finally relent. But then what they're doing is giving up their autonomy in order to maintain their relatedness to us, because it's kind of hard to tell mom and dad to go jump in a lake day after day after day. Here's what we do instead. There's a chapter in The Self-Driven Child called I Love You Too Much to Fight With You About Your Homework. Bill had been asked to write an article for McCall's Magazine, of all things, about homework. And the first thing he did was research how much does homework contribute to learning. And in elementary school, in middle school, a little bit. And in high school, an hour and a half or two. And over that, it actually is detrimental because kids are so often tired and stressed. And the ideal learning environment is relaxed and alert. So there's that. But what he said is, if we know that all this fighting is it's hard for our relationship, it demotivates kids, it's certainly not fun for us as parents, we pivot and say, I love you too much to fight with you about your homework. I do the most important thing in the world to me. I don't want to fight about this over and over. And I couldn't make you do this homework if you didn't want to. Again, you could go flat on the floor. But I'm happy to support you, to help you in any way that I possibly can. I'll be your consultant. I'll keep office hours. I'll quiz you on flashcards you want. I'll look over your paper if you want. Tell me, is there something that you need to get done where I can be helpful? And when we change the energy, because kids are so much less stressed when they don't feel controlled, they're so much more open to the great advice that you already have to give them. So here are the three implications, the three recommendations. The first is that you offer help and you offer advice. Don't just ram it down their throat, because then they bat it away, even though you know it's good advice. Say, hey, got a thought on that? Can I run it by you? If they say no, okay. You're respecting their autonomy. Chances are their curiosity will get the better of them. They'll come back around. Or if they figure it out on their own without us, hey, even better. They found that the solution is in them, not in someone outside of them. Second thing is that we let kids make their own decisions as much as we can. We don't have a 4-year-old in charge of the household, but we want to have kids have the opportunity to make as many age appropriate decisions as they can. This doesn't and be age appropriate means they can make a decision where you can support it, that it isn't crazy, meaning like 19 out of 20 people would say that is the worst idea that I've ever had, because the process of making decisions and then making mistakes, which they will because they're humans and adults in training, gives incredibly useful feedback. They have to think about the pros and cons. They imagine one scenario playing out and then it doesn't play out and you get natural consequences. The challenge is that you as an adult can see how this is going to play out, and it's going to be, version A. They think it's going to be fantastic. You're picturing, driving the car into the ditch. When we deprive kids of the opportunity to have decisions drive into the ditch, we deprive them of natural consequences. Don't let your kids do things that, like, they cut off a finger. I get it. But most things aren't really that life-threatening, particularly before you get to high school, when none of those grades matter. Middle school is the perfect time to allow kids to botch things. As a consultant, though, this is important. When there's a natural consequence, please resist the temptation to say, I told you so. In order to keep them open to your suggestions, you want to emotionally take their side on things. Oh my gosh, you studied so hard on that and you got a terrible grade when you really wanted to do well. In your head, you're thinking, I saw you watch the game for 3 hours. You said, boy, that must be really frustrating to want to do well. And your kid will say, I have no idea. But you can't imagine, the teacher was so unfair, whatever. By emotionally taking their side, they're also much more likely to eventually be honest and say, well, I probably should have started a little bit earlier. Starting at 8 o'clock was probably too late. Oh, do you think so? Well, that makes sense. Maybe we should try that this time. We want to be this consultant role where we're not in charge, because if we have kids think that someone other than them is responsible for their success, it doesn't go very well. And they're going to have the problem be yours when we want the problem to be theirs. So good or bad, they get to own it. They have to own it. Which brings me to the last point. Offer advice, let them make their own decisions. And one thing about, I'd say, making their own decisions, you might consider using language of, it's your call. Meaning that if you want your kid to talk through something and to be open-minded to your advice, you can say something like, hey, listen, blah, 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 such and such, I'd like to talk this through. It'll be your call what we do, but I just want to have a conversation. If your child knows that they get to make the decision in the end, they're much more likely to pro and con this and have an open conversation about the good and the bad of this. If they feel like your hand is already being forced, they'll be defensive even before you've been able to give them the wonderful insights that you have to share. Third part, offer advice, let them make decisions, is give them every opportunity to solve their problems, to solve and clean up the messes that they've made, whether that's a bad grade, whether they spoke out of turn to a teacher, whether they had a blow up with a friend, where they, cut from the soccer team, whatever. When your kids come home and they've struggled and they've goofed something up, it's your natural inclination to want to throw on your cape and go fix it. I get it. It's the way that I'm wired, for sure. The challenge is, if we do that and we solve problems for them and don't allow them to have an opportunity to solve things for themselves, we're back to creating rat Bs rather than rat As. And remember that we don't need a perfect outcome. It doesn't have to be that everything is just right. It's just that it has to be good enough. And if they can make things be a bit better, it increases their sense of control. And it's incredibly powerful for anyone to have the idea that I can take a big swing, and if I whiff that, and if I miss the ball completely, there's a way for me to salvage that and make that be good enough. And it makes kids a lot more courageous going out in the real life, because they have a sense of competency, and being able to clean up their own mistakes. It's just really, really powerful medicine. Okay. So this idea of being a parent consultant is really powerful, and I have seen this work over and over and over. I should point out, Bill does most of his work with kids where learning is hard and attention is hard, emotional regulation is hard. And he's seen this work over and over and over, where kids who are oftentimes fighting what's in their own best interest, and the parents are super stressed out and trying to give adults good advice, and the kid just isn't hearing it. And when we change the energy, we get much different outcomes. Sometimes, though, this may be a little bit surprising to kids if you talk about being a parent consultant. We got a terrific postcard from a mom who'd read this book, one of Bill's families, and she said, "I said to my son, I love you too much to fight with about your homework, but I'll help you in any way that I can." And at first he smiled, and then he hugged me, and then he said, "Is something wrong with you, Mom?" So this might be an adjustment if you've been a little bit more kind of authoritarian in kind of running point on homework. And if your kid is like, "What's going on here?" One way to reset and have them not be like, "What's going on?" is to simply say, "Hey, I noticed that the last few years I've been sort of taking point on homework and acting like it's my job for you to get your homework done. But you're older than you were then, and I think you may have needed that help back then, but I can see how much more capable you are. So I'm trying to make this pivot where I still want to give you all the support that you need, but I don't want to be overly controlling." And this is also, and some of you have kids who have learning differences, who have ADHD, other learning disabilities. And I'm sure there's some of you thinking, "Yeah, that's great for these kids, but what about?" And I'll tell you that this works for all kids. My son is quite ADHD, loveliest human being on the world, and my daughter, very late diagnosed with ASD and but. These are complicated kids. They're fantastic, but they're complicated. And this advice works across the board because whether you're autistic, whether you're a learning disability, whether you're dyslexic, whether you're ADHD, you still have a human brain. And these need to feel relatedness, competency, and autonomy, most of all, these are human needs. These are not neurotypical needs. These apply to everyone. Okay, so while it may be sometimes making this pivot into being a consultant means that you're giving your kid a greater control over their lives, but you are having to give up a little bit of control. And that can be hard. That can be stressful, right? A low sense of control is stressful for everyone, including parents. So here's what we suggest. Try to think about moving in the direction of being a non-anxious presence. So we borrowed this term from a wonderful consultant, a rabbi, educator named Edwin Friedman. And he made the observation that things go a lot better when the person or people who are in charge aren't overly reactive because stress is so contagious. If my amygdala is flaring and threat detecting going like crazy, all the people around me will have the same reaction, especially children who have spent a lifetime looking at their parents. They fall on the playground and do you get a different reaction because they're looking to us to say, how big of a deal is this? This is important because I work with a lot of kids, and Bill as well, who something's gone wrong, a bad grade, a bad score, a grad, whatever, and kids are upset about how it went, upset with me, upset with themselves, upset with SAT, whatever, and then they'll say, "Oh my gosh, but please don't tell my dad; he's just going to get so mad. Don't tell my mom; she'll get so freaked out." And that's suboptimal, right? Because nobody knows this kid and cares more about her than her loving folks. But it's her perception. I don't think it's true. It's her perception that her parents are going to handle this poorly. So what we suggest is making home feel, as much as you can, make it feel like it's a safe base so that kids can screw up, technical term, right, in friends, in school, in sports, and make mistakes. And when they do, they can bring it home to mom or dad or caregiver. We'll say, "Well, golly, that was hard." And when we're not overly emotionally reactive, it makes a big difference. Think about if you've, had a real health scare, and you go to the doctor and it's like, "Whoa, that's not going to help you think through how you're going to get through this," right? Because stress is incredibly contagious. The good news is that so is calm. When we were writing our second book, we learned that calm is contagious is a mantra of the Navy SEALs. So there are a few things that we suggest to move in the direction of being a non-anxious presence. The first is to try to take the long view. The fears that you have when your daughter's best friends break up with her and she's left alone is that she'll never have any friends, that these were the only people for her. And the thought of her not having friends for the next number of weeks, months, or years is absolutely terrifying to you. And so then you're trying to call up the parents and patch things up. And that's not likely to be the best path to go through there, in part because you're conveying to your daughter that the worst thing in the world for her is to not have these friends as friends, when this may simply be a time where she transitions. So we want to take the long view. Our fears about our kids are rarely about the present. They're usually about the future, and they'll end up living in a van down by the river. But if you knew that this was just part of their path, this was an adverse experience, and you're trying to help them with support cope with this, knowing this is a redirection in the path of their life, it's also a way that they develop future resilience. It'll be much easier for you to be less stressed. And if you can have confidence that, golly, this really stinks. That is just hard. And I'm confident that eventually, I don't know how, eventually, I think this will work out. It's a lot easier for kids to be less stressed and to think that this stinks, but somehow this will eventually work out. The second thing is, particularly if you have a kid where things are going poorly, either emotionally or in school, make it a high priority to enjoy your kid just as they are. Because when we put a lot or maybe too much energy in trying to fix how did it go, the thing that's going poorly, it kind of suggests to children that they're kind of only right in our eyes when they're doing things right. And if you do got a kid who's figuring themselves out or who's anxious or depressed, their best may be pretty not so hot, right? Not so hot. And you think, I've got to fix this thing. But it's really convey to kids that I can only handle you when you're at your best. And it's when kids are really at their worst that they need to feel like they're lovable simply because they are. Not because they've done things well or they've cleaned up their room or done anything like that. So especially important to shine a lot of love and affection, just like, when they walk in the room and say, just like, I'm so delighted to see you. And the way that you were when you beamed at them when they were, infants, that never gets old, to have people respond to you with warmth and affection. And then the other thing that I'll say about the idea of being a non-anxious presence is to take seriously what helps you lower your own stress. Because if you are stressed by whatever's going on in your own life, because a low sense of control is stressful. If you're feeling stressed in your life, you're likely to want to exert more stress over your children. And all the reasons we talked about that may be suboptimal, right? It's easier to support their autonomy when you're less stressed yourself. So I'll tell a really quick story about this. So my son, I have two kids that I mentioned. They're a little bit complicated. And my son decided to throw us a bit of a curveball as an adventure 2 years ago when he picked up, on bargain price, I'm sure, a brain tumor. He's doing great now, but that was a lot. My daughter had more complicated health issues going at the same time with Shara. Too long to share here. And this was, of course, during COVID. So this was a lot. And I'll say that when you think about the things that lower stress of personal connection, of time in nature, of sleep, of meditation, of exercise, all those things are really profound. And so if you find yourself being impatient or upset or frustrated with your kid, there's probably a good reason for that. But your tolerance, because we want to make home feel like a safe base, and we want to be able to remain equanimous, particularly when things are hard. And so if you've got a kid who's going through stuff, it becomes even more important that you do the things that, if the inflows of stress into you or your family or your community are not balanced by healthy outflows of stress, you can expect all sorts of things to go poorly. So if all of a sudden there's more inflows of stress, think hard about what you can do to relieve your own stress. Because if you do that and you move in this direction of being a non-anxious presence, you can be a stress sponge to your kid and help just bring stress out of their nervous system by making home feel like a safe base and they love no matter how messy the room or their life is. And it brings those prefrontal cortex, those executive functions back online, like I mentioned at the beginning, puts them in a position where they can more readily start to solve their own problems, put things into context, be more emotionally flexible, and move in the direction that we would like them to move. The last thing that I want us to talk about really quickly is giving kids an accurate model of reality. Most kids in America grow up with the idea that in order to be successful, they have to be top 10%. They have to top. We were given a lecture in Texas, and talked with a bunch of high school students and asked them, what do you understand is necessary to be happy as an adult? This boy raises his hand. He says, oh, let me back that up. Bill had asked them, how many of you want to be happy as adults? And they all like sheepishly raised their hands, like, well, duh. And he said, well, what do you understand is necessary to be happy as an adult? And they said, well, we understand that if we get into a good enough college, that everything else falls into place. And we know that's not true. And you know that's not true. And we want to make sure the kids understand that that's not true. Are there advantages to going to highly, highly academic colleges? Sure there are. First job especially. But we really would want to work hard. And it's not, in my view, it's not enough to simply to not be a source of stress for kids. Because the world is so kind of bonkers, at least compared to the one that I grew up in, we kind of have to actively work. We have to actively be an anti-stressor, right? And so many kids grow up with the idea that they have to be top academically. Otherwise, there's no future for them. And the reality is that many of us, for every kid who was precocious overachiever, there was a kid who was an underachiever who went on to build a wonderful life. So we talk about in our book, and I would encourage you to do this with your children as well, to talk about alternate routes, about people who started this college and transferred there, who dropped out of college and went back, who never went to college, who found all kinds of ways to build lives that they want, lives that are successful. And for us, a successful life is simply having a life that you want. It doesn't have to be anything defined by anyone else's terms, but just simply a life that you're happy with or happy enough with. And so when we see so many kids who are anxious all the time, because they think I can't thread that needle, I can't get through that door when so many other people are trying to go through that same door, or kids who aren't motivated because they're told that there's only one or two or three doors to go through, and they want to go a different way. When we can talk credibly about the meandering paths that we had and our aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, grandparents, and because few people go on a straight and narrow from A to B and then we're done, we kind of meander. And to know that it's safe to do that, we can help kids feel that it's safe to do that by talking about our own experiences and other people's experiences. And I'll go back for just one moment. When I talked about the nuts, the novelty, unpredictability, low sense of control, the same researcher who did that work said that cognitively, the single best tool to lower people's stress is to engage in plan B thinking. So you may have your sights set on, elite university X. I get it. Fantastic. And I want kids to work hard to go for the brass ring. But from a stress perspective, we want to know that we want to help them know that there are many paths. And so if they fall short of that, it's not, it's not Yale or jail, it's not BYU or bust, right? That's not the way that the world actually works, right? And so most mental health, curiously, is changing thinking from I have to I want to. And I have to, if it's all or nothing, we get some pretty unhappy outcomes there. If it's I want to, well, then we're working really hard for the thing that we want that matters to us. And this is really rooted in brain science that I have to is cortisol. It's the dominant stress hormone. And chronic stress is absolutely debilitating to developing brains. Shrinks the hippocampus, the memory center of your brain. It weakens those connections. I said the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. I want to is rooted in dopamine. And that's the get up and go, let's go get this thing kind of neurotransmitter. So I'll end with this. The most important work for tots and teens is to develop the brain that they'll carry into adulthood. It's not, and I can say this as a test prep geek, it's not the college that they go to, though there are advantages to going to this college or that college, a lot of beautiful places to get educated. But the most important work for teenagers is developing the brains, as well as who am I going to be and how do I want to contribute to this world before they enter adulthood, because teenagers are literally sculpting the brains that they'll carry into adulthood. So what we want for kids is to have a healthy sense of control, meaning that they can tolerate stuff that's hard and kind of stuff that's stressful. Last time I checked, the world is kind of a stressful place, and people can handle that who say, I can cope. They don't freak, they don't panic, they don't hide under the covers. They go out and courageously do the hard work of doing things that are hard. And we want them to be motivated in ways that aren't just, is someone going to give me a cookie? Is someone give me, is someone going to bribe me? Is someone going to give me something else or take away my phone if I don't do it? When they eventually leave our house, it's up to them to figure out what matters to them and to get them to do the things that support what matter to them. And so if we think about, again, brains under construction, and what we want to do in all the possible ways is to support the development of a healthy sense of control. And I'll leave you with this. A great theologian made a point, then picked up by Maya Angelou, that our children will forget so much of what we say to them, of what we do for them. But what gets wired into the brains is how we make them feel. And what I would wish for your children, as I wish for all children, is that they feel loved unconditionally, not for anything. They're just loved because they're lovable. That they feel supported, which is different from being pushed. Again, we offer help. We don't force it on them. And also that they feel trusted and they feel capable. We trust them with making decisions. We trust that they'll make mistakes. We'll trust that they're comfortable and capable, and we'll want to fix that and straighten out. And they'll circle back to us and ask our help and ask our advice, because we'll never stop loving them and wanting them to do well. But it's their life to live. And our job as parents is to help kids be ready to run their own lives. And they can't capably or credibly run their own lives unless they feel a healthy sense of control. So I'm Ned Johnson. I am an author, an educator, a parent like you. I have the best children in the world. They are complicated, occasionally messy, but it never gets old being a parent. Thanks for listening. Love your kids. Bye-bye.